So I'm going to be reading the entirety of Magic for Marigold. I have the ebook on Apple Books, and I just wanted to record this on YouTube because I feel that there was not any definite audiobook on YouTube with all the chapters. There was one that was missing one, so I thought I might as well just read it myself here to you. So the book is kind of long in chapters, like it's only 21 chapters, but each chapter is fairly long and they're split into parts, but we will be reading in the entirety of chapter 1 today. And just as a disclaimer, if I mispronounce any words or stutter a little bit, I am sorry. I tried to get it pretty much to as best as I could. Now that I'm actually going back, I know that I have been mispronouncing like words like Salome, but I will be fixing that in the third video, so enjoy. So, chapter 1. What's in a name? Once upon a time, which, when you come to think of it, is really the only proper way to begin a story, the only way that really smacks of romance and fairyland, all the Harmony members of the Leslie clan had assembled at Cloud of Spruce to celebrate old grandmother's birthday as usual. Also to name Lorraine's baby. It was a crying shame, as Aunt Nina pathetically said, that the little darling had been in the world 4 whole months without a name. But what could you do, with poor dear Leander dying in that terribly sudden way, just 2 weeks before his daughter was born, and poor Lorraine being so desperately ill for weeks and weeks afterwards? Not very strong yet, for that matter, and there was tuberculosis in her family, you know. Aunt Nina was not really an aunt at all. At least, not of any Leslie. She was just a cousin. It was the custom of the Leslie case to call every one uncle or aunt as soon as he or she had become too old to be fitly called by a first name among the young fry. There will be no end of these aunts and uncles bobbing in and out of this story, as well as several genuine ones. I shall not stop to explain which kind they were. It doesn't matter. They were all Leslies or married to Leslies. That was all that mattered. You were born to the purple if you were a Leslie. Even the pedigrees of their cats were known. All the Leslies adored Lorraine's baby. They had all agreed in loving Leander about the only thing they had ever been known to agree on. And it was 30 years since there had been a baby at Cloud of Spruce. Old grandmother had more than once said gloomily that the good old stock was running out. So, this small lady's advent would have been hailed with delirious delight if it hadn't been for Leander's death and Lorraine's long illness. Now that old grandmother's birthday had come, the Leslies had an excuse for their long-deferred jollification. As for the name, no Leslie baby was ever named until every relative within get-at-able distance had his or her say in the matter. The selection of a suitable name was, in their eyes, a much more important thing than the mere christening. And how much more in the case of a fatherless baby, whose mother was a sweet soul enough, but, you know, a Winthrop. Cloud of Spruce, the original Leslie homestead, where old grandmother and young grandmother and Mrs. Leander and the baby and Salome Silversides lived, was on the harbor shore, far enough out of the Harmony village to be in the real country. A cream brick house, a nice chubby old house, so covered with vines that it looked more like a heap of ivy than a house that had folded its hands and said, I will rest. Before it was the beautiful Harmony harbor, with its purring waves so close that in autumnal storms the spray dashed over the very doorsteps and encrusted the windows. Behind it was an orchard that climbed the slope, and about it always the soft sighing of the big spruce wood on the hill. The birthday dinner was eaten in old grandmother's room, which had been called the orchard room, until old grandmother, 2 years back, had cheerfully and calmly announced that she was tired of getting up before breakfast and working between meals. I'm going to spend the rest of my life being waited on, she said. I've had 90 years of slaving for other people, and bossing them, the Leslies said in their hearts. But not out loud, for it did not really seem at times as if old grandmother's ears could hear for miles. Uncle Ebenezer said something once about old grandmother to himself in his cellar at midnight when he knew he was the only human being in the house. Next Sunday afternoon, Old grandmother cast it up to him. She said Lucifer had told her. Lucifer was her cat. And Uncle Ebenezer suddenly remembered that his cat had been sitting on the edge of the potato bin when he said it. It was safest not to say things about old grandmother. Old grandmother's room was a long, dim green apartment running across the south end of the house, with a glass door opening right into the orchard. Its walls were hung with photographs of Leslie brides for 60 years back, most of them with enormous bouquets and wonderful veils and trains. Clementine's photograph was among them. Clementine, Leander's first wife, who had died 6 years ago with her little unnamed daughter. Old grandmother had it hanging on the wall at the foot of her bed, so that she could see it all the time. Old grandmother had been very fond of Clementine. At least, she always gave Lorraine that impression. The picture was good to look at. Clementine Leslie had been very beautiful. She was not dressed as a bride. In fact, the picture had been taken just before her marriage, and had a clan fame as Clementine with the lily. She was posed standing with her beautiful arms resting on a pedestal, and in one slender, perfect hand — Clementine's hands had become a tradition of loveliness — she held a lily, at which she was gazing earnestly. Old grandmother had told Lorraine once that a distinguished guest at Cloud of Spruce, an artist of international fame, had exclaimed on seeing that picture, "Exquisite hands! Hands into which a man might fearlessly pour his soul!" Lorraine had sighed and looked at her rather thin little hands. Not beautiful, scarcely even pretty. Yet Leander had once kissed their fingertips and said. But Lorraine did not tell old grandmother what Leander had said. Perhaps old grandmother might have liked her better if she had. Old grandmother had her clock in the corner by the bed, a clock that had struck for the funerals and weddings and goings and comings and meetings and partings of 5 generations. The grandfather clock her husband's father had brought out from Scotland 140 years ago. The Leslies plumed themselves on being Prince Edward Island pioneer stock. It was still keeping excellent time, and old grandmother got out of bed every night to wind it. She would have done that if she had been dying. Her other great treasure was in the opposite corner, a big glass case with Alicia, the famous Skinner doll, in it. Old grandmother's mother had been a Skinner, and the doll had no part in Leslie traditions, but every Leslie child had been brought up in the fear and awe of it, and knew its story. Old grandmother's mother's sister had lost her only little daughter of 3 years and had never been quite right afterwards. She had a waxen image of her baby made, and kept it beside her always, and talked to it as if it had been alive. It was dressed in a wonderful embroidered dress that had belonged to the dead baby, and wore one of her slippers. The other slipper was held in one waxen hand, ready for the small bare foot that peeped out under the muslin flounces. The doll was so lifelike that Lorraine always shuddered when she passed it, and Salome Silversides was very doubtful of the propriety of having such a thing in the house at all, especially as she knew that Lazare, the French hired man, thought and told that it was the old lady's saint, and believed she prayed before it regularly. But all the Leslies had a certain pride in it. No other Prince Edward family could boast a doll like that. It conferred a certain distinction upon them, and tourists wrote it up in their local papers when they went back home. Of course, the cats were present at the festivity also, Lucifer and the Witch of Endor, both of black velvet with great round eyes. Cloud of Spruce was noted for its breed of black cats with topaz-hued eyes. Its kittens were not scattered broadcast, but given away with due discrimination. Lucifer was old grandmother's favorite, a remote, subtle cat, an inscrutable cat so full of mystery that it fairly oozed out of him. The Witch of Endor became her name, but compared to Lucifer she was commonplace. Salome wondered, secretly, that old grandmother wasn't afraid of a judgment for calling the cat after the old Harry. Salome liked cats in their place, but she was furious when Uncle Clon said to her once, "Salome Silversides, why, you ought to be a cat yourself with a name like that. A sleek, purring, plushy Maltese." "I'm sure I don't look like a cat," said Salome, highly insulted, and Uncle Clon agreed that she did not. Old grandmother was a gnomish dame of 92, who meant to live to be 100. A tiny, shrunken, wrinkled thing, with flashing black eyes, there was a puckish hint of malice in most things she said or did. She ruled the whole Leslie clan and knew everything that was said and done in it. If she had given up slaving, she certainly had not given up bossing. Today she was propped up on crimson cushions, with a fresh frilled white cap tied around her face, eating her dinner heartily, and thinking things not lawful to be uttered about her daughters-in-law and her granddaughters-in-law and her great-granddaughters-in-law. Part 2. Young grandmother, a mere lass of 65, sat at the head of the long table, a tall, handsome lady with bright steel blue eyes and white hair, whom old grandmother thought a somewhat pert young thing. There was nothing of the traditional grandmother of caps and knitting about her. She was like a stately old princess in her purple velvet gown, with its wonderful lace collar. The gown had been made 8 years before, but when young grandmother wore anything, it seemed at once in the height of the fashion. Most of the Leslies present thought she should not have laid aside her black, even for a birthday dinner. But young grandmother did not care what they thought, any more than old grandmother did. She had been a Blithedale, one of the stubborn Blithedales, and the Blithedale traditions were as good as the Leslie traditions any day. Lorraine sat on the right of young grandmother at the table, with the baby in her cradle beside her. Because of the baby, she had a certain undeniable importance never before conceded her. All the Leslies had been more or less opposed to Leander's second choice. Only the fact that she was a minister's daughter appeased them. She was a shy, timid, pretty creature, quite insignificant except for her enormous masses of lustrous, pale gold hair. Her small face was sweet and flower-like, and she had peculiarly soft, gray-blue eyes with long lashes. She looked very young and fragile in her black dress, but she was beginning to be a little happy once more. Her arms, that had reached out so emptily in the silence of the night, were filled again. The fields and hills around Cloud of Spruce that had been so stark and bare and chill when her little lady came were green and golden now, spilled over with blossoms, and the orchard was an exquisite, perfumed world by itself. One could not be altogether unhappy in springtime with such a wonderful, unbelievable baby. The baby lay in the old Hepplewhite cradle where her father and grandfather had lain before her, a quite adorable baby with a saucy little chin, tiny hands as exquisite as the apple blossoms, eyes of fairy blue, and the arrogant, superior smile of babies before they have forgotten all the marvelous things they know at first. Lorraine could hardly eat her dinner for gazing at her baby and wondering, would this tiny thing ever be a dancing, starry-eyed girl, a white bride, a mother? Lorraine shivered. It did not do to look so far ahead. Aunt Anne got up, brought a shawl, and tenderly put it around Lorraine's shoulders. Lorraine was almost melted, for the June day was hot, but she wore that shawl all through dinner, rather than hurt Aunt Anne's feelings. That one fact described Lorraine. On young grandmother's left sat Uncle Klondike, the one handsome, mysterious, unaccountable member of the Leslie clan, with his straight, heavy eyebrows, his flashing blue eyes, his mane of tawny hair, and the red-gold beard which had caused a sentimental Harmony lady of uncertain years to say that he made her think of those splendid old Vikings. Uncle Klondike's real name was Horace, but ever since he had come back from the Yukon, with gold dropping out of his pockets, he had been known as Klondike Leslie. His deity was the god of all wanderers, and in his service Horace Leslie had spent wild, splendid, adventurous years. When Klondike had been a boy at school, he had a habit of looking at certain places on the map and saying, "I'll go there." Go he did. He had stood on the southernmost boulder of Ceylon and sat on Buddhist cans at the edge of Tibet. The Southern Cross was a pal, and he had heard the songs of nightingales in the gardens of Alhambra. India and the China Seas were to him as a tale that is told, and he had walked alone in great Arctic spaces under northern lights. He had lived in many places, but he had never thought of any of them as home. That name had been all unconsciously kept sacred to the long, green, seaward-looking glen where he had been born. And finally he had come home, sated to live the rest of his life a decent, law-abiding clansman, whereof the conclusive sign and token was that he had trimmed his mustache and beard into decency. The mustache had been particularly atrocious. Its ends hung down nearly as far as his beard did. When Aunt Anne asked him despairingly why upon earth he wore a mustache like that, he retorted that he wrapped it around his ears to keep them warm. The clan were horribly afraid he meant to go on wearing them, for Uncle Clon was both Leslie and Blithedale. He finally had them clipped, though he could never be induced to go the length of a clean-shaven face, fashion or no fashion. But, though he went to bed early at least once a week, he still savored life with gusto, and the clan was always secretly much afraid of him and his satiric winks and cynical speeches. Aunt Nina, in particular, had held him in terror ever since the day she had told him proudly that her husband had never lied to her. "Oh, you poor woman," said Uncle Clon, with real sympathy in his tone. Nina supposed there was a joke somewhere, but she could never find it. She was a WCTU and an IODE and most of the other letters of the alphabet, but somehow she found it hard to get the hang of Klondike's jokes. Klondike Leslie was known to be a woman-hater. He scoffed openly at all love, more especially the supreme absurdity of love at first sight. This did not prevent his clan from trying for years to marry him off. It would be the making of Klondike if he had a good wife who would stand no nonsense. They were very obvious about it, and with a renowned Leslie frankness recommended several excellent brides to him. But Klondike Leslie was notoriously hard to please. Catherine Nichols? But look at the thick ankles of her. Emma Goodfellow? Her mother used to call out meow in church whenever the minister said something she didn't like. Can't risk heredity. Rose Osborne. I can't stand a woman with pudgy hands. Sarah Jennett? An egg without salt. Lottie Parks. I'd like her as a flavoring, not as a dish. Ruth Russell! Triumphantly, as having at last hit on a woman with whom no reasonable man could find fault. Too peculiar. When she has nothing to say, she doesn't talk. That's really too uncanny in a woman, you know. Dorothy Porter. Ornamental by candlelight, but I don't believe she'd look as well at breakfast. Amy Ray? Always purring, blinking, sidling, clawing. Nice small pussycat, but I'm no mouse. Agnes Barr? A woman who says cow's formula instead of her prayers. Olive Purdy. Tongue, temper, and tears. Go sparingly, thank you. Even old grandmother took a hand and met with no better success. She was wiser than to throw any one girl at his head. The men of the Leslie clan never had married the woman picked out for them. But she had her way of managing things. He travels the fastest who travels alone, was all she could get out of Klondike. Very clever of you, said old grandmother, if traveling fast is all there is to life. Not clever of me. Don't you know your Kipling, grandmother? What is a Kipling? Said old grandmother. Uncle Klondike did not tell her. He merely said that he was doomed to die a bachelor, and could not escape his kismet. Old grandmother was not a stupid woman, even if she didn't know what a Kipling was. You've waited too long. You've lost your appetite, she said shrewdly. The Leslies gave it up. No use trying to fit this exasperating relative with a wife. A bachelor Clon remained, with an awful habit of wiring sincere sympathy when any of his friends got married. Perhaps it was just as well. His nephews and nieces might benefit, especially Lorraine's baby, whom he evidently worshipped. So here he was, unwedded, light-hearted, and content, watching them all with his amused smile. Lucifer had leaped on his knee as soon as he had sat down. Lucifer condescended to very few, but, as he told the Witch of Endor, Klondike Leslie had a way with him. Uncle Clon fed Lucifer with bits from his own plate, and Salome, who ate with the family because she was a fourth cousin of Jane Lyle, who had married the stepbrother of a Leslie, thought it ghastly. Part 3. The baby had to be talked all over again, and Uncle William over the bay covered himself with indelible disgrace by saying dubiously, "She's not really a pretty child, do you think?" All the better for her future looks, said old grandmother tartly. She had been biding her moment like a watchful cat to give a timely dig. You, she added maliciously, were a very pretty baby, though you did not have any more hair on your head than you have now. Beauty's a fatal gift. She will be better without it, sighed Aunt Nina. Then why do you cold cream your face every night and eat raw carrots for your complexion and dye your hair? Asked old grandmother. Aunt Nina couldn't imagine how old grandmother knew about the carrots. She had no cat to tattle to Lucifer. We are all as God had made us, said Uncle Ebenezer piously. Then God botched some of us, snapped old grandmother, looking significantly at Uncle Ebenezer's enormous ears and the frill of white whisker around his throat that made him look oddly like a sheep. But then, reflected old grandmother, whoever might be responsible for the nose, it was hardly fair to blame God for Ebenezer's whiskers. She has a peculiarly shaped hand, hasn't she? Persisted Uncle William over the bay. Aunt Anne bent over and kissed one of the little hands. The hands of an artist, she said. Lorraine looked at her gratefully and hated Uncle William over the bay bitterly for 10 minutes under her golden hair. Handsome is as handsome does, said Uncle Archibald, who rarely opened his mouth save to emit a proverb. Would you mind telling me, Archibald, said old grandmother pleasantly, if you really looked that solemn when you're asleep? No one answered her. Aunt Mary Martha over the bay, the only one who could have answered, had been dead for 10 years. Whether she's pretty or not, she's going to have very long lashes, said Aunt Anne, reverting to the baby as a safer subject of conversation. There was no sense in letting old grandmother start a family row for her own amusement so soon after poor Leander's passing away. God help the men, then, said Uncle Clon gravely. Aunt Anne wondered why old grandmother was laughing to herself until the bed shook. Aunt Anne reflected that it would have just been as well if Klondike, with his untimely sense of humor, had not been present in a serious assemblage like this. Well, we must give her a pretty name anyhow, said Aunt Flora briskly. It's simply a shame that it's been left as long as this. No Leslie ever was before. Come, grandmother, you ought to name her. What do you suggest? Old grandmother affected the indifferent. She had 3 namesakes already, so she knew Leander's baby wouldn't have to be named after her. Call it what you like, she said. I'm too old to bother about it. Fight it out among yourselves. But we'd like your advice, grandmother, unfortunately said Aunt Leah, whom old grandmother was just detesting because she had noticed the minute Leah shook hands with her that she had had her nails manicured. I have no advice to give. I have nothing but a little wisdom, and I cannot give you that. Neither can I help it if a woman has a bargain counter nose. Are you referring to my nose? Inquired Aunt Leah with spirit. She often said she was the only one in the clan who wasn't afraid of old grandmother. The pig that spits squeals, retorted old grandmother. She leaned back on her pillows disdainfully and sipped her tea with a vengeance. She had got square with Leah for manicuring her nails. She had insisted on having her dinner first so that she might watch the others eating theirs. She knew it made them all more or less uncomfortable. Oh, but it was fine to be able to be disagreeable again. She had had months to be good and considerate. She had had to be so good and considerate for 4 months. 4 months was long enough to mourn for anybody. 4 months of not daring to give anybody a wigging. They had seemed like 4 centuries. Lorraine sighed. She knew what she wanted to call her baby, but she knew that she would never have the courage to say it. And if she did, she knew they would never consent to it. When you married into a family like the Leslies, you had to take the consequences. It was very hard when you couldn't name your own baby, when you were not even asked what you'd like it named. If Lee had only lived, it would have been different. Lee, who was not a bit like the other Leslies, well, except Uncle Clon, a little. Lee, who had loved wonder and beauty and laughter that had been hushed so suddenly. Surely the jests of heaven must have had more spice since he joined them. Surely the jests of heaven must have had more spice since he had joined in them. How he would have howled at this august conclave over the naming of this baby! How he would have brushed them aside! Lorraine felt sure he would have let her call her baby, I think, said Mrs. David Leslie, throwing her bombshell gravely and sadly, "that it would be only graceful and fitting that she should be called after Leander's first wife." Mrs. David and Clementine had been very intimate friends. But Clementine! Lorraine shivered again and wished she hadn't, for Aunt Anne's eye looked like another shawl. Everybody looked at Clementine's picture. "Poor little Clementine," sighed Aunt Stasia, in a tone that made Lorraine feel she should never have taken poor little Clementine's place. "Do you remember what lovely jet-black hair she had?" asked Aunt Marcia. "And what lovely hands," said Great-Aunt Matilda. "She was so young to die," sighed Aunt Josephine. "She was such a sweet girl," said Great-Aunt Elizabeth. "A sweet girl, all right," agreed Uncle Clon, "but why condemn an innocent child to carry a name like that all her life? That would really be a sin." The clan, with the exception of Mrs. David, felt grateful to him, and looked it, especially young grandmother. The name simply wouldn't have done, no matter how sweet Clementine was. That horrid old song, for instance, "Oh, my darling Clementine," that boys used to howl along the roads at nights. No, not for a Leslie. But Mrs. David was furious, not only because Klondike disagreed with her, but because he was imitating her old lisp, so long outgrown that it really was mean of him to drag it up again like this. "Will you have some more dressing?" inquired young grandmother graciously. "No, thank you." Mrs. David was not going to have any more, by way of signifying displeasure. Later on, she took a still more terrible revenge by leaving 2/3 of her pudding uneaten, knowing that young grandmother had concocted it. Young grandmother woke up in the night and wondered if anything could really have been the matter with the pudding. The others might have eaten it out of politeness. "If Leander's name had almost been anything else, she might have been named for her father," said Great-Uncle Walter. "Roberta, Georgina, Johanna, Andrea, Stephanie, Wilhelmina, or Davidina," said Uncle Clon, but Great-Uncle Walter ignored him. "You can't make anything out of a name like Leander. Whatever did you call him that for, Marian?" "His grandfather named him after him who swam the Hellespont," said young grandmother as rebukingly as if she had been not 35 years before, cried all one night because the grandfather had given her baby such a horrid name. "She might be called Hero," said Uncle Clon. "We had a dog called that once," said old grandmother. "Leander didn't tell you before he died that he wanted any special name, did he, Lorraine?" inquired Aunt Nina. "No," faltered Lorraine. He had so little time to tell me anything." The clan frowned at Nina as a unit. They thought she was very tactless. But what could you expect of a woman who wrote poetry and peddled it about the country? Writing, it might have been condoned and concealed. After all, the Leslies were not intolerant, and everybody had some shortcomings. But selling it openly? "I should like a baby to be called Gabriella," persisted Nina. "There has never been such a name among the Leslies," said grandmother, and that was that. "I think it's time we had some new names," said the poetess rebelliously. But every one looked stony, and Nina began to cry. She cried upon the slightest provocation. Lorraine remembered that Leander had always called her Mrs. Gummidge. Come, said old grandmother. "Surely we can name this baby as well comfortably as uncomfortably. Don't make the mistake, Nina, of thinking that you are helping things along by making a martyr of yourself." "What do you think, Miss Silversides?" inquired Uncle Charlie, who thought Salome was being entirely ignored and didn't like it. "Oh, it doesn't matter what I think. I am of no consequence," said Salome, ostentatiously helping herself to the pickles. Come now, you're one of the family," coaxed Uncle Charlie, who knew, so he said, how to handle women. "Well," Salome relaxed because she was really dying to have her say in it, "I've always thought names that ended in IEN were so elegant. My choice would be Rosalind." "Or Evangeline," said Great-Uncle Walter. "Or Eglantine," said Aunt Mercia eagerly. "Or Gelatin," said Uncle Clon. There was a pause. "Juno would be such a nice name," said Cousin Teresa. "But we are Presbyterians," said old grandmother. "Or Robinette," suggested Uncle Charlie. "But we are English," said young grandmother. I think Yvonne is such a romantic name, said Aunt Flora. Names have really nothing to do with romance, said Uncle Clon. The most thrilling and tragic love affair I ever knew was between a man named Silas Twinkletoe and a woman named Kitsia Birtwhistle. It's my opinion children shouldn't be named at all. They should be numbered until they're grown up, then choose their own names. But then you are not a mother, my dear Horace, said young grandmother tolerantly. Besides, there's already a Yvonne Clubine keeping a lingerie shop in Charlottetown, said Aunt Josephine. Lingerie? If you mean underclothes, for heaven's sake say so, snapped old grandmother. Juanita is a rather nice and common name, suggested John Eddie Leslie over the bay. Juanita. Nobody would know how to spell it or pronounce it, said Aunt Marcia. I think, began Uncle Clon, but Aunt Josephine took the road. I think. Plus a dom, murmured Uncle Clon. Aunt Josephine thought he was swearing, but ignored him. I think the baby should be called after one of our missionaries. It's a shame that we have 3 foreign missionaries in the connection, and not one of them has a namesake, even if they are only a 4th cousins. I suggest we call her Harriet after the oldest one. But, said Aunt Anne, that would be slighting Ellen and Louise. Well, said young grandmother, haughtily. Young grandmother was haughty because nobody had suggested naming the baby after her. Call her the whole 3 names, Harriet, Ellen, Louise, Leslie. Then no 4th cousin need feel slighted. The suggestion seemed to find favor. Lorraine caught her breath anxiously and looked at Uncle Clon. The rescue came from another quarter. Have you ever, said old grandmother, with a wicked chuckle, thought what the initials spell? They hadn't. They did. Nothing more was said about missionaries. Part 4. Sylvia is a beautiful name, ventured Uncle Howard, whose first sweetheart had been a Sylvia. You couldn't call her that, said Aunt Millicent in a shocked tone. Don't you remember great-uncle Marshall's Sylvia went insane? She died filling the air with shrieks. I think Bertha would be more suitable. Why, there's a Bertha in John C. Leslie's family over the bay, said young grandmother. John C. was a distant relative who was at outs with the family. So Bertha would never do. Wouldn't it be nice to name her Adela? Said Aunt Anne. You know, Adela is the only really distinguished person the connection has ever produced. A famous authoress. I should like the mystery of her husband's death to be cleared up before any grandchild of mine is called after her, said young grandmother austerely. Nonsense, mother. You surely don't suspect Adela. There was arsenic in the porridge, said young grandmother darkly. I'll tell you what the child should be called, said Aunt Sibylla, who had been waiting for the psychic moment. Theodora! It was revealed to me in a vision of the night. I was awakened by a feeling of icy coldness on my face. I came all out in goose flesh, and I heard a voice distinctly pronounce the name, Theodora. I wrote it down in my diary as soon as I arose. John Eddie Leslie over the bay laughed. Sibylla hated him for weeks for it. I wish, said sweet old great-aunt Matilda, that she could be called after my little girl who died. Aunt Matilda's voice trembled. Her little girl had been dead for 50 years, but she was still unforgotten. Lorraine loved Aunt Matilda. She wanted to please her, but she couldn't call her dear baby Emmelinza. It's unlucky to call a child after a dead person, said Aunt Anne positively. Why not call the baby Jane, said Uncle Peter briskly. My mother's name. A good, plain, sensible name that'll wear. Nickname it to suit any age. Jenny, Janie, Janet, Jeanette, Jean, and Jane for the 70s. Oh, wait till I'm dead, please, wailed old grandmother. It would always make me think of Jane Putcamer. Nobody knew who Jane Putcamer was, or why old grandmother didn't want to think of her. As nobody asked why, the dessert having just begun, old grandmother told them. When my husband died, she sent me a letter of condolence written in red ink. Jane indeed. So the baby escaped being Jane. Lorraine felt really grateful to old grandmother. She had been afraid Jane might carry the day, and how fortunate there was such thing as red ink in the world. Funny about nicknames, said Uncle Clon. I wonder, did they have nicknames in biblical times? Was Jonathan ever shortened to Joe? Was King David ever called Dave? And fancy Melchizedek's mother calling him that. Melchizedek hadn't a mother, said Mrs. David triumphantly, and forgave Uncle Clon. But not young grandmother. The pudding remained uneaten. 20 years ago, Jonathan Leslie gave me a book on the hereafter, said old grandmother reminiscently. And he's been in the hereafter 18 years, and I am still in the here. Anyone would think you expected to live forever, said Uncle Jarvis, speaking for the first time. He had been sitting in silence, hoping gloomily that Leander's baby was an elect infant. What mattered a name compared to that? I do, said old grandmother, chuckling. That one was for Jarvis, the old ass. We're not really getting anywhere about the baby's name, you know, said Uncle Paul desperately. Why not let Lorraine name her own baby, said Uncle Clon suddenly. Have you any name you'd like her to call, dear? Again, Lorraine caught her breath. Oh, hadn't she? She wanted to call her baby Marigold. In her girlhood, she had a dear friend named Marigold, the only girlfriend she ever had. Such a dear, wonderful, bewitching, lovable creature. She had filled Lorraine's starved childhood with beauty and mystery and affection, and she had died. If only she might call her baby Marigold. But she knew the horror of the clan over such a silly, fanciful, outlandish name. Old grandmother, young grandmother, no, they would never consent. She knew it. All her courage exhaled from her in a sigh of surrender. No, oh, she sighed in a small, hopeless voice. Oh, if she were not such a miserable coward. And that terrible old grandmother knew it. She's fibbing, she thought. She has a name, but she's too scared to tell it. Clementine, now, she would have stood on her own feet and told them what was what. Old grandmother looked at Clementine, forever gazing at her lily, and forgot that the said Clementine's ability to stand on her own feet and tell people, even old grandmother, what was what, had not especially commended her to old grandmother at one time. But old grandmother liked people with a mind of their own when they were dead. Old grandmother was beginning to feel bored with the whole matter. What a fuss over a name! As if it really mattered what that mite in the cradle with the golden fuzz on her head was called. Old grandmother looked at the tiny sleeping face curiously. Lorraine's hair but Leander's chin and brow and nose. A fatherless baby with only that foolish Winthrop girl for a mother. I must live long enough for her to remember me, thought old grandmother. It's only a question of keeping on at it. Marian has no imagination, and Lorraine has too much. Somebody must give that child a few hints to live by, whether she's to be Minx or Madonna. If it was only a boy, it would be so easy to name it, said Uncle Paul. Then, for 10 minutes, they wrangled over what they would have called it if it had been a boy. They were beginning to get quite warm over it when Aunt Myra took a throbbing in the back of her neck. I'm afraid one of my terrible headaches is coming on, she said faintly. What would women do if headaches had never been invented? Asked old grandmother. It's the most convenient disease in the world. It can come on so suddenly, go so conveniently, and nobody can prove we haven't got it. I'm sure no one has suffered as I do, sighed Myra. We all think that, said old grandmother, seeing a chance to shoot another poisoned arrow. I'll tell you what's the matter with you. Eye strain. You should really wear glasses at your age, Myra. Why can't those headaches be cured? Said Uncle Paul. Why don't you go try a new doctor? Who is there now that poor Leander is in his grave? Wailed Myra. I don't know what we Leslies are ever going to do without him. We'll just have to die. Dr. Morehouse drinks, and Dr. Stackley is an evolutionist. And you wouldn't have me go to that woman doctor, would you? No, of course not. No Leslie would go to that woman doctor. Dr. M. Woodruff Richards had been practicing in Harmony for 2 years, but no Leslie would have called in a woman doctor if he had been dying. One might as well commit suicide. Besides, a woman doctor was an outrageous portent, not to be tolerated or recognized at all. As great-uncle Robert said indignantly, the women are getting entirely too intelligent. Klondike Leslie was especially sarcastic about her. An unsexed creature, he called her. Klondike had no use for unfeminine women who aped men. Neither fish nor flesh nor good red herring, as the young grandmother had been wont to say. But they talked of her through their coffee, and did not again revert to the subject of the baby's name. They were all feeling a trifle sore over that. It seemed to them all that neither old grandmother nor young grandmother nor Lorraine had backed them up properly, with the result that all the guests went home with the great question yet unsettled. "Just as I expected. All squawks, nothing but squawks as usual," said old grandmother. "We might have known what would happen if we had this on Friday," said Salome as she washed up the dishes. "Well, the great affair's over," said Lucifer to the Witch of Endor, as they discussed a plate of chicken bones and Pope's noses on the back veranda. "And that baby hasn't got a name yet. But these celebrations are red-letter days for us. Listen to me purr." And that's the end of Chapter 1. Thank you for listening.